So in this booklet was this article about this fellow getting fired, and the outcome of the court case was that he was, and he was off for several weeks or months, and he was to be rehired and back pay and so on, and reinstated on his job. So when Pete came in and he was giving me this story about what he was going to do, I said, well, before you do that, Pete, I said, you better read this story. I went over to the corner where we ate our lunches and got this booklet, and I said, you better read this, and then you better consult your lawyer before you do. So he did that, and then he realized that he just couldn't do what he wanted to do. And very soon after, the board of whatever sent in notice that there would be a hearing in Vancouver on a certain date, and there'd be a board of what would you call it, a arbitration or something, you know, and they would arbitrate this request by the Teamsters Union to organize the employees at Kalesnikoff Lumber. And Pete came back with this and showed it to me, and he said, now I've got to go to the coast, and he said, I've got to hire a lawyer and go down there, and he said, it's, oh man, he said, you know, he was going on about this and so forth. And the notice posted in the shop where I worked said that any employee wishing to submit or to make a submission to this board could do so simply by writing to this address, you see, writing it and mailing it to this address. Or if you wish to appear in person, you were entitled to do so. So I talked it over with Pete, and I said, well, Pete, if you like, I will write a letter on your behalf petitioning this thing. Because as far as I'm concerned, if we were to be organized here, it should either be the IWA or the Pulp and Paper Workers of Canada, which I believe are the union at the pulp mill, and that's where Pete's chips went to. And as much as Pete didn't like the idea of unions, he said, yeah, he said, if the crew ever said, 51% of them said that they wanted to become unionized, I would have no way of stopping them, he said. But I don't like this setup. So I wrote a letter to the chairman of that board, and amongst other things I said that Kalesnikoff Lumber had been in the habit of following the established or the pattern established by the IWA, and in almost every case they complied with the settlement terms of settlement of any IWA agreement. And I outlined one or two instances where they didn't, that we didn't have these things, you know, such as seniority and things like that. But I said, it taxes the credibility of union people to see the Teamsters Union come in here in an IWA territory as far as woodworkers are concerned, and if not IWA, then pulp and paper workers. It taxes their credibility to see this kind of an organization come along and establish a union local here that would be subject to Teamsters bylaws, etc., and Mr. Kalesnikoff not having no permit to construct a burner or anything, must get the chips out of this plant to whatever place he can dispose of them. Otherwise, not only is the chip truck shut down, but the whole sawmill will be shut down in a matter of 4 or 5 hours, plus the logging operation, which would mean 75 or 80 people. So if we're going to be organized, we should be under the IWA or some comparable union. And Pete won this appeal. And so he came back and he said, I would like to start a cost sharing, a profit sharing thing. And I said, for what reason? Well, he said, if you fellas joined the union, he said, and there was a strike, and the union negotiations were going on from June, and we were getting into October and September, and there was no agreement in 1975, I think it was. And finally, Dave Barrett had to advise the Teamsters who were refusing to transport goods to Vancouver Island, as well as other places, but that's where the hardship was, and the IWA, which was still negotiating and threatening to go on strike, you see. And he said, I'll give you to the end of November to settle this thing. Well, you know, in the last dying hours, the IWA settled for a fairly healthy settlement. And this we didn't know yet, you see. And Pete was saying, I want to start this profit sharing. And I said, Pete, you're paying a fair wage. You've kept abreast of the IWA. Is it something you have in mind that you're going to break that policy? Oh, no, he said. Well, I said, if that's the case, you are paying me a fair wage, and I'm satisfied with everything else. You don't owe me anything more. You don't owe me any bonus on top of that to pay me to stay out of the union. I said, if I want to get in the union, I'll leave here and go and get in the union. Well, it wasn't long until the IWA made this settlement, and it was a fairly sizable settlement. I forget what the dollar figures were, but it seemed to me like it was $1.35 an hour or something, which was, you know, considerably more than what we expected. And we were, I think, in the range of $9 an hour at that time, which was a pretty fair wage. And then if we'd have got another 75 or 80 cents, I'd have thought that was a good settlement, you know. Instead of that, we got this. So here's Pete caught with this kind of a settlement, and he went around to the mill crew and saw the planer crew and told them he wasn't going to pay it, and he wouldn't pay any retroactive pay and so on. And at these organizational meetings that he was having regarding this profit sharing, he had said he would pay it, you see, pay the IWA settlement. And I thought, you know, well, anyway, I came to work on afternoon shift, and I wondered what was all this big gathering out in the mill yard, you know. Nothing seemed to be happening, just a bunch of people standing around. So I got into my coveralls, and it was cold. It was in late November, and I guess coming on the end of November, and this was going to become effective 1st of December or whatever. And so the IWA agreement meant that there was retroactive pay to the 1st of July. I believe it was 1st of July when that new contract was due to be in place. So one of the guys from this group outside came in and said, Bob, he said, we're having a discussion out here in the yard with management. He said, we'd like you to come. And of course, that was typical of my nature and so on. Yeah, I went. So I stood there, and getting colder by the minute, and the debate was going on between the employees, the sawmill employees and the planer employees and the first aid man and the weigh scale operator and so on, that show us some reason. Pete was telling them he couldn't pay it. He just couldn't pay it. And they said, well, show us some reason. Show us a financial statement or something that tells us that you can't, shows us that you can't pay it. And I'm standing there thinking, you know, Pete, you promised these guys a raise, you promised them this. If you'd said, look, I can't make it, but I'll give you 50 cents or something, that would have been better than just flat rejection of the whole deal. And that was an oversight or just a mistake on Pete's part. And the crew were angry at this kind of a breaking of a promise. So I stood there for a while, and I said, you know, folks, we're not getting anywhere right now. We've broken down into an argument, and it's too damn cold for me to stay out here any longer. And this, I think, was a Thursday evening. I said, I'm going back in the shop, but before I go, I'd like to ask that we reconvene this meeting Monday night in the shop. Would that be all right? I asked Pete, where it's warm and we can talk, and everybody has time to settle down and think things over. And he said, okay. So the crew broke up right away. And those that were going on afternoon shift went to work, and those that were going off day shift went home. And I went back to the shop. But before I went, they all disappeared, and I'm standing there with Pete. He's standing off 6-7 feet away from me with his son-in-law and other management people. I said, Pete, you promised these fellas that you would follow the IWA agreement. And I said, you need to do something to sort of cover for that, because just to simply say I'm not going to pay it and turn your back on them is what's causing this kind of problem. And I said, it's not going to be easy to straighten out. And he looked at me just as you're looking at me, and he nodded his head, and he said, okay. So Monday night, I came to work, afternoon shift, and I walked in there, and I thought, Jesus, what's everybody doing in here? You see, these things never bothered me, from one day to the next. I thought it was a simple process of reaching an understanding and carrying on. And here's all the crew, oh yeah, that's right, we're having a meeting tonight, So we weren't there more than 5 or 10 minutes, and here come Pete, and again with 3 or 4 of his management people, and he started in to lecture us. And he'd gone to his bankers, and the bankers said we were crazy not to carry on working as we were, and so on. And that a lot of us would be laid off, and you'd either be on unemployment or have to go to work further away from home. And he really had his approach all straightened out in his mind. And so he said a lot is going to be laid off. So when he was finished, he said, where is the friendship and the loyalty gone? So we stood there in silence for a few minutes, and finally I said, and I was one of very few non-Doukhobor people there. I don't think there were more than 3 of others that weren't Doukhobors probably working there besides myself. I said, fellas, if you have anything to say it now. Don't walk out of here and start holding another meeting and complaining about what's happened. This is the place, this is the time to make your speech. And nobody said a word. And I said, well, I'm a fairly new employee by most standards here, so I said, all I have to say is that friendship and loyalty, Pete, are a two-way street. The crew were working for you under an agreement, an understanding that we had with you, and you couldn't uphold your end of that deal. And you didn't make any other offer. You just simply said, shut her down. And that's where it's at. That's why we're here. So everybody disbanded. And some walked by me and said, we've been hosed, and they're going on. I thought, just exactly what I told them not to do. They're going to go out there and start bitching and complaining. And off they went, back to work, and I carried on. As I say, this was Monday. Came to work Tuesday, and Wednesday, probably Wednesday, when the young lad that was in charge of the shop in the day shift, he came to me and he said, Bob, he said, whatever you do, be careful. He said, Pete is out to get you. I said, Bill, I'm older than you and I'm older than Pete. And I've made it this far in my life. I said, I'll make it the rest of the way. regardless of what Pete does. So don't let it worry you. I said, I knew what I was doing when I did it. And that was Thursday, I think. Wednesday or Thursday, doesn't matter. Friday evening I came on shift and I worked till about 6 o'clock, and Pete came in. And he stood beside me and he said, I'm laying off all the afternoon shift in the planer. And there'll just be one, because the planer can keep up with the mill as a rule, more than keep up with the mill. And I'm laying off all the afternoon shift in the shop. And there's one man afternoon shift. Guess who that would be? And I said, and when does that take effect? He said, tonight at midnight. And don't wait to get back on. And I said, okay. And I went to work that evening and I went through the book of all the little jobs that had to be done. And I knew them all pretty well by heart, because I had put them in that book for the day shift people to see and for my own record, And I cleaned up all the little jobs, broken shock absorbers, and there was one cracked frame member, and I welded that, and that meant tearing it apart and welding it and putting it back, and so on, and all these things, and got them all cleaned up and put my tools away and so on. And I didn't have a vehicle there to pack my tools home in, so I had to come back the next day to do that and so forth. So some of the members tried to get the Labor Relations Board to look into this situation, and they kept referring to me, you see, in all their talks with the labor relations people. The labor relations people called me in to see them. And I said, if I want to take any action, I'll initiate it myself. And they kept this up, till the story spread around that I was threatening to organize the union there. Now, Wayne Nolan was one of the people who said to me shortly afterwards, he said, Bob, there was an ideal time to have organize that into an IWA operation. I said, I'm sure it was, but I wasn't disposed to seeking revenge or anything. I said, if I was going to do that, I should have done it while I was working there. So the thing drifted off, and I wasn't home very long, and I got on at KFP. They were doing a bunch of renovations, and it was a short-lived operation. It was in the dying days of KFP. And I worked there for about a month, and I never worked in such a rotten son of a bitch of a place, I had tools that were handmade, pry bars and so on, by good old blacksmiths for me. And one of them got stolen right off the bat. I was working on a job, and the foreman came and asked me if I would move this electric motor. And I said, okay, so I left my tools over there. They weren't 50 feet away, and by the time I got through doing this other job, it was lunch break. By the time I came back after lunch, some of my tools were gone. And that's just a no-no in any job. If you find something that's lost, you turn it in at the office, somebody comes and asks about it and gets it back, but to take it, steal it, So I was pretty upset with that outfit, and I was home here for a while, and there was a fellow living up the valley here who was a millwright, the head millwright in Salmo at Idaho Forest Products. And he said, Bob, oh yeah, and I went over there and applied for a job. They were putting on an afternoon shift over there, and I thought, well, they're going to need somebody to look after their forklifts and all that sort of stuff, and I'll go over there. So I went over there to apply for the job, and I was talking to the foreman, the general foreman of the place, and this millwright was standing there. And we'd known each other for 20 years or more, 30 years. And that night he phoned me. He said, it never occurred to me while I was talking there, while you were talking to the foreman, he said, he's the lead. This guy I'm talking about is the lead hand amongst the millwrights, you see. So he said, we need another millwright. He said, I was talking to him about that very thing. And he said, what the hell? He says, you got a heavy-duty mechanics papers and so on. And he said, there's not much difference in the kind of work. And he says, I know you'd catch on right away. He said, you can do just about anything we can do. So how about coming to work with us? And I said, sure. He said, that way we can share transportation. He said, we change cars every day. You take one day and somebody else the next day, and we can just leave our cars at your place. There was 2 of them coming from up here, and three from up north of me, and myself made 4, and then we picked up one guy in Nelson, and 5 of us, just a carload, you see. So I worked there for 3 years with this guy. And we were under an IWA contract there, and this was a special crew. This was a crew for establishing, installing, I shouldn't say establishing, for installing new equipment or building and installing new equipment. Trim saws, and they were started doing a major overhaul in some parts of that mill. We extended the green chain by maybe another 50 feet, and oh yes, maybe another 75 feet, and we did all kinds of things.
Idaho Forest Products, was that the Louisiana Pacific?
Yeah, eventually. Yeah. And we built a new compressor room and installed another compressor, a huge compressor that they took out of an old mine. And we worked separately from the regular mill maintenance people. We worked as a crew. If there was a major maintenance project, we took it on. And we worked whatever shift it took, all weekend or whatever, to get that in place for Monday morning. And sometimes we worked all night for several nights in a row to get something changed over from an old system to a new system. In fact, the lead hand and so on, and we all worked together to build this whole sections and then put them in, you know. So we got a 50 cent an hour increase in wage over the regular maintenance crew because of these kinds of situations. And as time went by, the regular crew began to complain about this. There were 5 or 6 regular millwrights there, and they began to complain about this. And there was no way that the company was going to bring them up to our standards, but there would be a way where they'd bring us down to their standards, you see. And if that's all that they wanted, was to bring us down to their standards, then we weren't going to go for it. And as much as I didn't know what the IWA policy was on it, I felt that it was the wrong direction to go. If they wanted to stand by us and get their wages up to, and then spend part of their time doing what we were doing, and share some of the regular employment with us guys, maybe that would be a workable solution, although it would break up our transportation situation. Well, guess what? The bloody thing went to arbitration. And we had the first meeting in Nelson, arbitration meeting in Peebles Motel. And we had a lawyer hired by the IWA, and none of the regular crew were present at these hearings and so on. And it came about that I took a certain stance in respect to how this thing worked, and I said that I felt that if I didn't comply with the management's request that I go down to the other lower wage, that it would only be a short while till they would say that they didn't need another man on this special crew, or 2 or 3 of us, or maybe disband the special crew. And somehow or another, and I can't remember just how, but somehow or another that conflicted with the point of view that our lawyer was taking. And he began to lecture me on this. And Wayne Nowlin and all the other employees involved and the local fellow, Wayne came over from Cranbrook, and there was a local guy, I can't think of his name right now, I can see him but I can't think of what his name is. They were not sure just who was right and how this would work. And I said, well, I tell you, I said, I'm going to be heard one way or another. I said, I am by far the senior person in age here, and consequently with an experience at the art of living, that this is my position on it. And if I'm asked up on the witness stand, this is what I'm going to say. Well, he said, I'll declare you a hostile witness. The lawyer. I said, you do what the hell you like. I said, I'll do what I like. And if we're going to pull together, that's the only way we're going to win this thing. And if we're going to be divided, that's the first way we're going to lose it. And I didn't see any disagreement from the IWA directors that were there. So several, maybe 2 or 3 months went by before the next hearing, and the next hearing was in Cranbrook. So we all got in my car, and 5 of us, and over there we went. Well, I'm telling you, this head millwright, this lead hand from up the valley here, was a very fine guy in every way that I knew, and an excellent millwright. But he just came apart when he was cross-examined. He weighed about 280 pounds. You see a man that size, and he finally is so emotionally upset that he can't speak. And the cross-examiners can be ruthless, you know, the company lawyer and the company officials and so on. And one of them has a reputation for being bull-headed, hard-boiled character. And we're sitting, and this is happening, and I put up my hand, and the arbitrator was the president of the BC Bar Association. And I had been told that he was a very fine guy, and don't cross him up, because he knows what he's doing. I put my hand up, and he acknowledged me, and he said, what is it, you know, what would I like to say? I said, I've lived all my life in the area where I'm living now, and I've lived amongst thousands of the people who settled there in the time of about that I was born. And I've grown up with them, and I know their ways. I even know their language. And I said, they are not capable of going through this sort of thing that you and I, who accept the idea of representative government, and we accept the idea of courts and justice and hearings of this nature, and they are not in any way acquainted with this. It's against their natural law of their lives to understand and go through this kind of a performance. I said their whole lifestyle is based on a pacifist belief where you don't have these kinds of struggles. And so on behalf of this witness, I said I would take his place. Our lawyer tried to intervene and had me declared a hostile witness. And the arbitrator overruled, and he said, I think that he knows what he's talking. I had an experience a little while later with that same millwright. And I worked there, as I say, 3 years, and this happened in the middle of that 3 years approximately. So I was there for a good year or more afterwards. And one time I was grinding a piece of metal for a welder to put up as a support for something, and I was trimming it, and he was waiting for it, and he said, "Bob," he said, "if there's any irregularities, we just fill them in with weld." So I handed it to him, and they did that. And later on, maybe a couple hours later, this lead hand said to me, he said, "You know, Bob, I agree with your concept of fitting things properly." He said, when I was an apprentice, I worked with a millwright who said to me one day, "If we're going to call ourselves professionals, our work should look like it." And several years later, I was on the school board, and we had a big renovation project to do on one of the schools in Nelson. And this bloody school had stone walls 18, 20 inches thick, you know, and so on, built in 1913. And they had added on to it with concrete construction. And at the end of this addition, they had left reinforcing steel sticking out of the wall to add some more on later on. And 25 or 30 years had gone by and nothing had been done. And this place had an auditorium on the top floor with a sloping floor in it and a stage and so on. And the school staff had pointed this out to the architect, and they said, "This is in the center of the school on the second floor. It is the ideal location for our library, without taking away any space, classroom space. And what needs to happen is all this trash needs to come out of there. This auditorium floor, I forget what was going to happen to that. It was going to be put in level or something. And it would give an 8-foot ceiling in this library, and it meant removing all these old fabricated wooden beams, trusses in there that were built in 1900, 1912 or somewhere, whenever that school was built, 1913 I think I said. And there was one steel beam through there, or two of them, that were about 30 inches in depth, girders, you know, and they would be removed and so on. And the architect was a professional, no two ways about it, and he devised the way that it would all be done. And as the building changes progressed, there would come a time when they could pull those two big steel beams out through the wall and right out onto the street with a big crane, you know, just on rollers and so on, because there was no way you could get at the other end of them, you see. They were embedded in the stone walls and so on. So this meant a lot of jackhammer work and so on, closing some doors and moving them and a few things like that. A big project. And eventually the building would be extended and there'd be a music classroom, which there wasn't any in this building, you see. And they had 2 or 3 portables out there, and the bands were going out there to practice, and it was a dog's breakfast. And this had been going on for years. There was no proper rooms or space for the cafeteria, and the stairwells were badly laid out and what have you. And this new plan would take care of all of those issues, and it would bring that building up to standard, you know, without having to destroy a good heritage building. And it would embody everything in the building from here on. It wouldn't be out in the yard and portables and so on. So we sent this proposal. This proposal was gone over and over and over. And finally, after a period of months, we sent it to the ministry. And the ministry of that day took it apart, and they just butchered it. And they were going to compromise and give us about 1/3 of the renovations, which would mean we'd be right back where we started. We wouldn't have taken advantage of any of the real good designing and so on that had gone into this. So after a lot of conversation by telephone and so on through our board's administrators and school staff and so on, getting nowhere. So the superintendent, chief executive officer of the school board, he said, Bob, we've got to go to the coast in a short while. I said, what for? He said, to see the ministry about this Trafalgar School system set up. Oh yeah. So, I'm thinking to myself, you guys know all the terminology, you know the reasons, you know all this kind of thing. You guys go ahead. Oh yeah, he said, we'll go, but we need a trustee. We need a board representative, and you're chairman of the Building and Transportation Committee, and you got to come with us. And I said, oh, I don't know if it'll do any good to take a trustee there. That gets political. Well, he said, you got to come. So off we went. We took our maintenance superintendent, our secretary treasurer, and our superintendent, who's this chief executive officer, and the principal of that school, and myself. And we arrived down there and get settled into a motel, and the ministry's representative, assistant deputy minister in charge of facilities, was a big Irishman, and we invited him over to our motel. And of course, there was a variety of glasses and bottles on the table. And he says, he looked around and he sat down, he had a drink with us, and he said, I suppose you fellas figure you'll get me drunk here tonight and you'll get what you want tomorrow. And I jumped up and I said, who the hell spilled the beans? So anyway, we had a good get-together there. The next day we sit down in this office on Blanchard Street, and it's a big long room, and there's a big long table like from here to the wall, and there's this Ministry of Education people sitting all around there, and they all got degrees in finance and in architecture and in engineering and in everything, education and all this stuff. And I just barely made it through grade 8 in elementary school, and I'm sitting there, and here's these people from our side of this, and they are debating this issue, and they are debating it, and our architect and so on, and I'm sitting there listening to all this and thinking, where in the hell is this thing going? It looks like we're going to wind up with about just what we got on paper, about 1/3 of this whole project. Maybe we're gaining a little bit, but damn little. No music room, no this, no that, no library in that place, and so on. Not going to touch it. Finally, this Jim Doyle, the assistant minister, or deputy assistant minister of assistant deputy minister of education, he's sitting on just over on my right, and he turned to me and he said, Bob, we haven't heard from you yet. What do you think of this thing? And I said, well, I've been listening to all this discussion, and I said, not much progress being made anywhere. But I said, there's been 3 fires in Creston, Castlegar, and Quesnel in high schools. And up to this date, there's been no fatalities. But my grandson was in that school in Quesnel, and they said it was a pretty panicky situation getting out of there for the smoke and so on. And I said, I'm probably the only one of this bunch that's crawled through that area, other than our maintenance supervisor, that's crawled down this manhole and gone into that vacant space where they want to put the library. And I said, that is just a tragedy waiting to happen. It is cluttered up with everything, dust and everything else. Spontaneous combustion, if nothing else, can take place in there. And sitting around this table, I said, there's a number of you people who have degrees in what you're doing. And I used to work with a millwright that grew up as I did, and he said, if we're going to be professionals, our work should look like it. And I said, the outside of that building has only one comparable structure in BC that I know of, and that's the BC Pen. And I said, there's angular reinforcing steel sticking out of the walls for 30 years. It's an insult to the city of Nelson and the school board and the Ministry of Education. And I said, if you guys want to progress or go along with what you're saying, all I intend to do is go back and induce that board to hands off, cancel the whole project, because I don't want to be responsible for structuring something half done, or done in a half-baked style. And that's all I got to say. And the guy down at the end of the table was the person from the finance department. He said, you know, I think I know the solution. He said, this is a big project, and we'll only get it half done this year, or the year within the fiscal year that we start. And he said, let's divide it into two parts. And when we start the first one and get the money approved for it, it'll be a smaller sum, but we'll do it according to the blueprint that the architect has put forth, library and all. And then when we get well on into that year and things are going, we'll start on the second project, and I can guarantee I'll get it through the Ministry of Finance. And we'll have the whole thing in two pieces. And we walked out of there in 10 minutes with a package deal.
Well, that's quite a connection between those two stories.
There's no connection?
There is.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And I had an hour with that guy yesterday, that same millwright. We had a good chat, a good visit. But we never touched on those kinds of things. I just did say that I learned from two people, including the one at the West Kootenay and himself. You know, I learned a great deal. And he's a younger man than I am by 5 or 6 years, you know, but he's a good millwright. So that's the connection that runs parallel, and as you know, two parallels never meet, but it runs parallel to the union activity, because a lot of the things that you wanted to do under some of the old systems could only be done if you were stood in good favor with the employer. Whereas in so many cases in the union activities, these things came about as a matter of course because you had recourse to some other approach. And I'll give you an example of that if you want to spend a few more minutes.
Sure.
I was at Kootenay Forest Products, and I was working, I'd worked 3 years at Salmo, and I was the last one of that crew. The rest had all gone on to other jobs. Because there was, even though we won that arbitration hearing, there was little problems always put in our way, divide us up and so on, so we had to travel separately and trying to break us up, you know. And it worked. It created the process of attrition went into effect, and the next thing I knew, one of the guys got a job somewhere else, and then the next one, and then the next one, and finally I was traveling alone to work there. And I came home one night, my wife said, "Bob, there's a phone call for you. Here's the name." And I said, "Oh yeah, I know the guy." It turned out I didn't know the guy that was calling. It was his son. I knew the old man, but I didn't know the son. You see,
Hicks.
Eh?
Hicks.
Well, no, it was Kootenay Forest Products, and it was Nick Cunningham. And Nick Cunningham Sr. had been the foreman in that mechanical shop for years. But he had so much trouble with getting along with the crew that his son grew up and took over. And he became the foreman in the mechanical shop. And he was quite a good person to get along with. Very good person. But old Nick tended to hold sway there. He acted as though he were in charge, and he maybe held a lead hand position or something, but he was very dominant factor, and you did exactly what he said, even if you knew it was wrong. And there was no recourse, you see, but at least he figured there wasn't, that he had been there so long that he could overrule anything, and he'd run right off to the office right away if he was looked like there might be a problem, you know. So a few things happened here and there along the way, and there was no job steward in that shop. The one from over in the mill would come over occasionally, and at times in the beginning it was Ted Sullivan. And I said to him, Ted, I said, how does this was one of the first incidents, I said, how does this IWA Lumber Workers Council joint venture work for this pension system, this IWA pension system? Well, he outlined it to me. And I said, when you become retirement age, you can draw your pension? Well, absolutely. But I said, can you keep on working 2 days a week on weekends? Well, I said, we got a real problem in this shop, I said, with Nick Sr. trying to run this shop as a dictator. And he's given us a bad time at every turn of the wheel. And he's on his pension, full pension, and working full time. Jesus Christ! Well, in no time at all, that stopped. He either had to relinquish his pension or lay off, retire. So he had to relinquish his pension because he wouldn't retire. So him and I kept having problems, and to make matters worse, he kept getting proved wrong in mechanical things. And it came down to he had a new guy, apprentice, hired, and he wanted to know if I was going to stay and so on. But I just thought to myself, you know, there's a probation period of 60 days or something like that, and I'm going to stay till that's over before I say anything. And I said, oh yeah, I like working here and so on, you know. This wasn't quite true to my nature, you know, but I thought, two can play this bloody game. So we had a room upstairs to eat our lunch in. And the compressor was sitting in the corner there, a huge compressor to keep that shop going. And they had built this room for the compressor room because the condensation was too down below. It was down near the floor. The condensation in the compressor tank was always causing problems, so they put it up there. Now, whether that was a lunchroom before or a compressor room, I don't know which, but it was unbearable to sit there and eat your lunch with that bloody thing running. And there was no place. You got out of your car and you came into work, and there was no place to hang your coat. No place. Just a piece of bent wire hanging over a pipe, and soot all over from diesel engines running, and, you know, just a hell of a mess. Good solid concrete floor, and the shop had been extended, and the piece of shop that had been extended, some guy had the brainwave of putting the hot water heating pipes in the floor. Man, you could lay on your bare back in there in the middle of winter, you know, and work on that floor, you know, under machinery, let alone on a creeper. But the other part over there where the forklifts and so on were assembled and tire work was done was a little different, but it wasn't bad. And I was on mostly afternoon shift. Every now and then they had to rotate you to day shift periodically. But because I'd gotten on this god-darn school board, I had to have time off occasionally too. And that wasn't too handy. But young Nick was pretty accommodating. And old Nick had some good qualities, but he didn't know where the hell they were most of the time for proper use, you see. And his what would you call it, definition of what the contract was totally different than the average person. And to give you an idea of how far things could get out of hand was one day he put me to work at breaking apart the bead on a skidder tire. And I just went, there was 2 or 3 of them to be done. They were replacing the tires on the, and they are a bastard to get apart. You use not an 8-pound hammer, a 12-pound hammer and wedges and so on. So I went around, I had changed thousands of tires in my life, and I just took we had a 2-gallon can with a spout on it full of a mixture of antifreeze and water, just the right 50-50 mixture for to add to the forklifts and whatever other vehicles came in. Give you minus 30 degrees protection, you see. Well, that ethylene glycol is a kind of a slippery stuff. But don't confuse it with a lubricant like oil, because it will cause oil to separate and turn into a real glue. So you can't mix it with oil. But I used to take this can and pour it around the bead, and as I started to get some distance between the bead and the rim, that stuff would get in there, and pretty soon the bead would fall off. Well, I probably, when they bought their ethylene glycol in barrels, and you could go to the store and buy it for $4 a gallon or $5 a gallon, it probably cost them about $1 a gallon in that barrel when they bought several barrels of it. And if there was a gallon in that can of, I think we mixed it 50-50, there'd be a gallon of water and a gallon of in there, so there'd be $1 worth of antifreeze in there, and I'd use about 2 cupfuls to put around this bead. He says, you know how much that's costing? And I said, yeah, probably 15 cents. Bullshit. So we get into a big argument. And I had already broken 1 bead apart, and I'm starting on the second one. He said, you leave that. I got something else for you to do. He put 2 men to work on that goddamn tire, and they're there for half an hour, and Andy's tire man came out with a truckload of tires. And he walks in the shop, Ev Kuhn, I know him well, you know. Hi Bob, how are you doing? And I said, oh, fine. And these 2 guys are over there with big bars and these kind of bars like rams, you know, and they're trying to break this goddamn thing apart. And it's as dry as a popcorn fart, and it's not going anywhere. And Ev walks in, he said, what are you guys up to? We're trying to break this bead, and they are guys that are sweating. He said, for God's sake, he said, hasn't anybody showed you? And he went over and he grabbed this bloody can that I was using, and he went over and poured it around the ring, and Nick was standing there with his face hanging out, and about 6 or 8 more beats and the bloody thing fell apart. Well, maybe I'm grinning and maybe I'm not, but anyway, you know, Nick looked my way and I just nodded my head like that, you know. Well, then the final climax came when Christmas was coming. And the contract said that to get your pay for Christmas Day and Boxing Day, you needed to work the first scheduled day before Christmas, and the last scheduled day before Christmas, and the first scheduled day after, to get your holiday pay. But Christmas was coming on Thursday, or Wednesday, and you would have to come to work Monday and Tuesday, you take off Wednesday and Thursday, come back Friday, and you're off again Saturday. And they were shutting everything down in the bush and everywhere else except for the snow plowing. That was essential, because the snow plowing wouldn't happen if it didn't snow. But if we had a big dump of snow, they'd have to go out, or they'd just be blocked up. They wouldn't, you know, it would mean taking D8s and stuff out there to open the roads again, whereas the grader could do it, you see. So there was a green poster put on the office door outlining this situation. So we had gone to the job steward, who in turn went to management and said, is it essential that the production crew, planer mill, sawmill, and all the rest, be here Friday? And the management said, no, it's not worth our time to open the building and heat the place and all that. All this could be altered by mutual agreement. So I was working outside. I come in the shop, and Ted Chakowski, who didn't speak English all that well, but a pretty good thinker, came to me and one of the other guys who was born and raised here, and they said, "Bob, we got a problem." And I said, "Oh yeah, what's the problem?" And they said, "Nick is saying that we got to come to work Friday." And it meant that he had to drive all the way from Weimar to come to work Friday, because we are emergency crew in case anything breaks down. "Oh," I said, "I don't believe that." I said, "I understand that we are a production crew, and if the bush operation shut down, we don't need to be here." "No," Nick says, "if we don't do this, we don't get paid, we don't get our holiday pay." This is Nick Sr. "Well," I said, "there's a poster on the door over there that states it very clearly, and I'm going over to read it." And he said, "Well, he's already told us guys we're not going to get paid." And I walked over towards this door and I met Nick halfway. He knew exactly what was going on. He said, "Is something you want?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to go and read that poster." He said, "It just says what the agreement is." I said, "I know what it says, but I'm just going to make sure." "Well, do you want to get paid for your holiday pay?" I said, "Of course. So does everybody else." "Well, you'll get paid." But he didn't say you got to work Friday. Well, between then and noon, the crew said to me, and I had no more authority to be the job steward, and nobody had appointed me or anything, that we want to walk out right after lunch in protest. And I said, "That's just what he'd like you to do. We have an agreement, and IWA has an agreement with this employer, and that agreement has got two sides to it, our side and their side. And if we break it, we're responsible for the consequences. And we're not going to break it. We stand together." One of them said to me, this English-speaking fellow, "What the hell kind of a union man are you?" He said, "You're supposed to walk out." And I said, "You wait and see." So at lunchtime, we ate our lunch, and Nick is sitting there eating with us. And I said, "Nick, we want to talk to you about this problem." "You keep your goddamn mouth shut," he said. "You have nothing to say." I said, "I have every bit as much to say as you have, and you have no right to go over to the office on our behalf. None whatsoever. You're not appointed by anybody." And he stormed away, And I said, "Well, it's simply this, Nick. If this isn't settled by coffee break this afternoon, a delegation from this shop, possibly the whole crew, are going over to the office. We're not going down the road, as some people would like to do. We're going over to the office, and we'll straighten it out. And you can be there if you like." Well, no sooner we got over lunch, and there's a breakdown in the dry kiln. A forklift got in there with a load of lumber, and they got to go in between the rails, and it's a dirt floor, and there's ties and one thing and another, and he stalled the thing in there with this big, he was trying to push these carloads of lumber in the kiln, and he stalled the engine, and somehow or another, when he did that, he tried to start it and jammed the starter, broke the starter bendix or something. I just forget what happened there. But here's this machine stuck under 15 tons of lumber, and you can't raise the forks, you can't get the hell out of there or anything. And you can't fix it in there. You can't get underneath it to get at the starter and so on. So Ted Chakowski and I, we take the 966 log loader, and we take some chains and cables and whatever have you, and we go over there. And we get that bloody 966 into that dry kiln. We moved piles of lumber and we did everything. And we got it through between doors and wiggled it around and got it in there. And we got a hold of that bloody forklift. And I did all the rigging and so on. And Ted ran the loader. And we got that bloody thing out from under that pile. And we raised the forks up and chained them up in the air out of the way so that they wouldn't be dragging on and catching on the rails. And then we bulldozed that bloody thing out of that shop, and we got it back into the shop. Lunch break, coffee break was over and everything. It's 3:30 in the afternoon. We worked right through coffee break and what have you, and we got that bloody thing in there. And this is just a few days before Christmas, you see. In fact, this is the Tuesday. This is Christmas Eve. Well, everybody's standing around with their arms folded and their tools put away and what the hell have you. And I thought, what the hell is going on? And we come in, and Nick is standing there, rather sheepish. And the boys said, well, Bob, we have the rest of the afternoon off. We've got our paychecks. And we don't have to come back Friday. Clean up your bench, put your tools away, and you're free to go home. Well, I thought, son of a bitch. What happened? Nick went over to the office, and I guess he got straightened out. And he was back, and he's standing there. And I stood there till everybody was gone. When everybody was gone, Nick was standing there and looking at me and so on. I said, you know, Nick, if Christmas meant to you what it means to me, this goddamn problem never happened. We got a new lunchroom out of it, place to hang our coats and hats and everything. And then, of course, the following year, and things started to get better and better, just by degrees. There was no more of this kind of harassment and so on. Oh, I shouldn't say no more. You could still see Nick was itching to get into some position where he could control your life, you know. But he finally had to take retirement, where his pension would be deducted, you know. And then high interest rates hit just like a hammer, you know. The mill changed hands. Local management bought into it. Reg Barber and a whole bunch more. And they woke up they bought it at 9% interest prime rate. They woke up one morning, it was 15. Then it was 16. It finally came to 21 within a short period of time. And they had to cut back. They had to cut back drastically or go out of business. And they dealt with it firmly, and it was hard on a lot of employees, you know. But there was one layoff for several weeks. I think altogether I was laid off 16 weeks in these two layoffs. And then I was taken on, and then I was laid off again. Everybody with less than 9 years seniority was laid off. And I was 63 years old, or 64, something like that. And coming 64, I guess. And I was laid off in September, right around the 1st of September. And one of my boys that was living with me, my wife had died, and we were batching here, and one of the two boys that were still living with me got laid off too. And I think I worked a few days longer than he did. And then I was faced with a critical situation where I still had the mortgage to pay and so on. And I went up to Prince George to visit one of my boys up there, and he said, Dad, when you were here, this was not September, had to be in August, because I went to Prince George and came home, and an old trucker friend of mine in the Prince George area had an operation up in Mackenzie,